This November, California voters will have their say on 17 ballot propositions and initiatives, the most measures on the state ballot since 2000. Several would make changes in the state's criminal justice system. Will they make us more or less safe? We'll hear from the state's authoritative voice for nonpartisan analysis, Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst, and two experts in criminal justice with the Legislative Analyst Office, Drew Soderberg and Anita Lee. California's propositions. It's a crime. Or is it?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. This November, voters are going to be confronted with a myriad of initiatives and propositions. Our guest is Mac Taylor, California's legislative analyst, and he's tasked with the making sense of all these propositions for the rest of us. Welcome, Mac.
Thank you, Mark.
So, public wants to put something on the ballot. How does this process, how do you go about initiating something?
Well, that's one of the great things about California. Anybody can, in effect, be a California legislator. If you have an idea and a couple $1,000s, you can have your proposed legislation, in effect, circulated amongst the people. You have to get a certain number of signatures. It's based on the prior vote for governor.
Right, that's important because the last vote for governor was kind of low, and so then the threshold of signatures you need is lower, which means it's, and actually it costs you money to get those signatures. You have those people outside the food stores signing people up. They're not doing that for free. They're not volunteers.
Generally, no.
Right, and so it's cheaper then to put things on the ballot. So this time, we're seeing a lot of stuff on the ballot.
There was. Of the 17 measures that are going to be on the ballot, 14 of them were initiatives.
Wow.
So really the ballot, as far as statewide measures, is dominated by the initiative process. So you go out, and if you get the required number of signatures, then it goes on the ballot. We do an analysis of that measure. The Attorney General does a title and summary to tell you what the nature of the measure is, and then that will show up in your voter guide that the people will be receiving this fall.
Now, we've had you on the program many times, usually around budget season, but folks should understand that your office is it's called the Legislative Analyst Office, but that shouldn't be confused with you work for the legislature in a partisan way. You are nonpartisan, correct?
That's absolutely correct. We work for both houses, both parties, all 124 members of the legislature. Okay,
so let's talk about the LAO. We're going to do it briefly here. I'm not going to call you legislative analyst each time. The LAO's role in the ballot process, what exactly do you guys do?
Well, when an initiative is initially put through to when they want to have it circulated for signatures, we do a quick fiscal analysis with the administration's budget office. Now, when it qualifies, when it actually gets the signatures and goes on the ballot, then we do a lengthier analysis, just my office, that describes the measure, talks about its effects on state and local government, and that's the lengthier analysis that will show up in the voter guide.
And that's things that folks really ought to read.
Well, I think it provides helpful information. Sometimes there's background and context, the effect on state and local governments. It's not going to tell you everything that you might want to know. And obviously you can't expect people to read all 17, but they may selectively want to go and read some more background if they want to learn a little bit more.
But as the more I've been involved in this, the more I rely on the LAO for really good advice. And I want to just let our audience know, if you really want to learn about a topic and you want to get an unvarnished truth about that topic, a great place to look is the LAO website. They really go into detail and try to cover both sides of the issue and do a really nice job. So hats off to you guys. But you haven't always been doing this. And this is, I guess, what, 1974, Prop 9 gave you this responsibility.
Yes, that was put on the ballot by then Secretary of State, Jerry Brown.
Oh, okay. So it all comes back full
so.
circle. I wonder if he's happy or not that he did that. So let's talk about some of these ballot propositions that are on the November ballot. As you mentioned, there are 17 of them. There are different things that make up, these ballot propositions. You've got voter initiatives, you've got some put on by the legislature, you've got referendums. Can you kind of describe all of that?
Certainly. Like I said, of the 17 total measures that people can vote on this November, 14 of them were put on by initiative.
Okay.
One was put on by referendum, and that was another one of the big three progressive reforms back in the early part of the 20th century. The Hiram Johnson sort of reforms.
What was their idea of putting these, allowing the voters to put these things on the ballot?
At the time, the power of the railroads was sort of predominant, and it was sort of the people's way to sort of circumvent certain big moneyed interests, is the way I guess the progressives would phrase it. But anyway, it's just the power of the people acting in effect as the legislature. So in an initiative, you're actually proposing a law, just like a legislative body would. On the referendum, it's a little bit different. It's when the legislature has passed a law, but the people will collect signatures to say, before it goes into effect, we want the people to vote on this law. Wow. And that's the one referendum we have on the single-use plastic bags initiative.
That's right. And it's interesting, though, you mentioned that because you think about the progressive movement and the reason for this, the proposition, the initiative process, the referendum, to let the voters decide. A lot of these things are bankrolled today by special interests. So,
well, yeah, I don't know how you would define special interest, but certain by interest groups sponsor these in a way. But it is the people's ability to go in and propose whatever sort of initiatives they want.
So up next, we're actually going to talk a little bit about some of those initiatives with some of the staff that works at the Legislative Analyst's office, and we're going to look at one of the more controversial ones up next, and that is the legalization of recreational marijuana. That conversation next. This is the Maddy Report. For a more in-depth analysis of this and other public policy issues important to Californians, please log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org and click on the Policy Analysis tab. Welcome. One of the measures receiving the most attention on this year's ballot is Prop 64, which would legalize marijuana for recreational purposes. Now, California voters rejected a similar measure back in 2010, but since then, 4 states, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and the District of Columbia, have passed measures legalizing the recreational use of marijuana. Our guest is Drew Soderberg. He's an expert in criminal justice and a managing principal analyst with the LAO. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Drew, let's start talking about this issue, about where we are right now. What is the current state and federal law as it relates to marijuana?
Sure, so we'll start with state law. Marijuana, of course, is illegal under state law, and penalties range from fines for possession to prison or jail time for marijuana sales. However, voters legalized marijuana for medical uses in 1996. In addition, the state...
20 years ago.
That's correct, yeah, so it's been quite a while. In that time period, there wasn't a great deal of regulation, but the amount of regulation has increased recently. So the legislature recently passed a series of bills to increase the regulation.
They may have seen this coming, and they wanted to have something in place before it potentially passes.
It's possible that may have been.
And the federal government, is there a legalization of marijuana there?
No, so under federal law, marijuana is illegal, even for medical use, and even in states that have legalized it. However, the U.S. Department of Justice generally doesn't prosecute marijuana users or businesses if they're abiding by state law, and those state laws are written and enforced in a way to uphold federal priorities, like preventing marijuana from getting diverted to other states or going to children.
Yeah, going to children. So, in other words, there is a federal law that says no, there's a state law that says yes, and the feds could preempt.
Correct.
The state, but they've decided to keep hands off as long as they follow certain guidelines.
Correct.
Okay. Now we've got this ballot measure. How would it change marijuana regulation in California?
Sure. So Prop 64 can really be thought of in 4 different pieces. First, it legalizes the non-medical use of marijuana for adults age 21 and over. So individuals, for example, could smoke it in their home, but there would be some restrictions. So you couldn't generally smoke it in public. Second, it would create a system for regulating the recreational marijuana market that would be largely similar to the one adopted for the medical marijuana market.
So you kind of know what you're getting, right? I mean, if someone's buying marijuana in the medical market today, at least you know the THC levels and those kinds of things. If you're buying it on the street, you don't know what you're getting.
That would be the hope of the proponents, okay. Yes. And then the third aspect is that it imposes taxes both on medical marijuana and non-medical marijuana. It imposes a tax on the growing of marijuana and on the selling of marijuana, and directs that the revenues raised be directed to specific things, for example, youth programs, environmental protection, and law enforcement.
They got you coming and going. They're going to get you both ways, growing and selling. Okay, and there's also a fourth thing, is they're changing the penalties, correct?
That's correct. The last thing is that they're generally reducing marijuana penalties, though some marijuana penalties remained unchanged, such as driving while intoxicated by marijuana. Those penalties wouldn't change.
Okay, and also, and selling marijuana, now you can get up to, I understand, 4 years in state prison or county jail, and in the future, what?
So in the future, the penalty would come down, so it would depend on what exactly the violation was, but individuals would be subject to civil penalties for not having a license to sell, and they could be subject to, I believe, misdemeanor penalties.
Now, the big issue here, the elephant in the room, is the fiscal impact of legalizing recreational marijuana. You know, you think of some areas like Humboldt County that could stand to, frankly, bring a lot of revenue in if this passes. What is the fiscal impact of legalizing recreational marijuana, not just for a particular area like Northern California, but the state generally?
So there's a lot of uncertainties about what the fiscal impact will be. So I kind of want to preface some of these comments by putting those out there first. First, How state and local governments choose to tax and regulate marijuana will affect it, whether the federal government changes policy and starts enforcing marijuana laws, and then finally, how marijuana prices and consumption change following legalization. However, those sort of caveats in mind, we estimate that state and local governments could eventually get new revenues in the high hundreds of millions to over $1 billion. But it's important to note that it could take several years before that level of revenue comes in.
It's only in state government. You say, oh, $100 million, that's not a lot of money. But just to put it in context, the state budget is about, $122 billion. So this would be $1 billion out of a $122 billion budget. So it's significant. $1 billion is significant, but in the scheme of things, it's less than 1%.
That's true, and it's important to remember that all that money would be directed to specific purposes, like I mentioned, or a significant portion of it, excuse me.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to talk about some crime and safety measures on the November ballot. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with experts from the state's Legislative Analyst Office about the 17 measures on this November's general election ballot. We're going to talk about crime and safety next. The LAO's Drew Soderberg is with us still, so let's talk about Prop 57. Governor Brown's initiative that would allow early release of inmates convicted of some specific non-violent crimes. Can you set the stage? Where are we right now on criminal sentencing?
Sure. So individuals in prison have been convicted of a primary offense that they're serving time for. However, they may also be serving additional time for sentencing enhancements or other crimes they may have committed.
So it's kind of they stack things on. There's the primary crime, you rob somebody, and then there's maybe a lesser crime, oh, you used a gun, and or maybe there's an enhancement of something like you were in a gang.
Exactly.
So it adds up.
The three strikes law is probably the most prominent example of enhancements that have been applied. However, inmates can reduce the amount of time they serve through sentencing credits. These credits are typically awarded for participation in rehab or educational programs or good behavior, but state law really limits the amount of credits that the state prison system can award.
So when you're up for parole, if you have the primary sentence and they got the lesser crime, then you have the enhancements, when are you up for parole? At what point are you up for currently?
Well, it will depend on your sentence. So there are indeterminately sentenced individuals who've received sentences like 25 years to life. They would be up for parole on their 25th year. Okay. However, there are some determinately sentenced individuals who qualify for parole hearings in addition. So a good example is if you committed your crime before you were the age of 18, you're eligible for a parole consideration hearing. I believe it's in the 15th year of your sentence.
Okay, so how would Prop 57 change the current system?
So Prop 57 would change the system for adults by changing the state constitution so that individuals are eligible for parole consideration, assuming they've committed a nonviolent offense, after they've served their primary term. That means that at the discretion of the Board of Parole hearings, they might be released before they would serve any additional time for sentencing enhancements.
So that secondary crime, that enhancement wouldn't be counted. They just focus on the primary crime, and that's where they decide where parole is appropriate.
Exactly. And then the other major change is that the Constitution would be changed to give the state prison system broad authority to award inmates credits.
What's going to be the fiscal impact on the state and local governments?
So the primary fiscal impact is really from the changes to the adult system, and we estimate that there could be savings for the state, net savings in the tens of millions of dollars.
So that's because they're not housing these people in state prison. But that means they're on the street. What is the calculation for the cost of maybe the crimes that they commit now that they're on the street?
Well, so when they go out on the street, they'll either be supervised by counties or by the state. Though it's important to note that the counties and state would have supervised them likely eventually anyways, and so those aren't necessarily new costs. Now, there could be additional costs associated with new crimes they commit, though it's difficult to estimate exactly how many additional crimes would be committed or if the measure would just change the timing of those crimes.
One of the things is because they're allowing for more credits for good behavior, getting education. One of the arguments for the proponents is they're saying, listen, it's more likely these people are going to re-enter society and they're not going to commit crimes because we're giving them incentive in prison to change their behavior. So
that's correct.
Kind of tough to know what the costs are going to be. Anita Lee, who's a criminal justice expert with the LAO, is also joining us. I'm going to talk about Prop 63, and that deals with guns and ammunition.
Yes.
That sounds like a hot topic. So let's talk about currently, where are we on the situation with the sales of guns and ammunition in California?
Sure. So first thing to kind of realize is in California, prohibited persons or certain individuals who are convicted of felonies and certain misdemeanors are not allowed to possess firearms or ammunition. So firearms dealers currently have to request background checks from the state to ensure that people who are buying firearms are not prohibited at the time they're trying to purchase them. Prior to this year, the state...
That's assumed that the database is correct, too.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. And so prior to this year, the state didn't regulate ammunition sales in the same way that it did firearms. Okay. But the state passed, recently enacted legislation in July to increase the regulation of ammunition sales, most notably by requiring that state licensed ammunition dealers would be required to check with the state to ensure that people seeking to buy ammunition were not prohibited.
There's going to be a rush on stores now probably to buy ammunition before this thing passes. But so there are restrictions on the possession of guns and ammunition in California, and people don't realize. Some people think that anybody can get a gun. There are restrictions. There are certain people that if you've created felonies and misdemeanors, if you're a danger to yourself or others, if there's a restraining order against you, all of those are reasons why you may not be allowed to have a gun.
Yeah.
So what would Prop 63 do exactly?
Sure. Proposition 63 has a number of different provisions. One major provision is that it would create a new court process to ensure the removal of firearms from prohibited persons at the time that they are convicted. It also includes a number of various provisions that are similar to recently enacted law for increasing regulation of ammunition sales, such as licenses to sell ammunition or background checks prior to selling ammunition.
It was interesting that the state auditor did a report a little while ago about these folks that aren't supposed to have weapons, people who've committed felonies and whatnot, and how, frankly, a poor job the state has done in getting those weapons back from people who have felonies. And maybe this is somewhat a response to that. So what's the fiscal impact of Prop 63 on state and local governments?
Sure, it really breaks down into three portions. So first, related to the new court process, that's likely to result in state and local court and law enforcement costs, potentially in the tens of millions of dollars annually. Related to
you got to enforce this.
Yes.
Okay.
Related to the changes to ammunition regulations, that's likely to increase state costs as well, but those would generally be offset by the various fees that are authorized by this measure and existing law.
Otherwise known as taxes. Okay.
And then finally, the measure does change certain penalties related to firearms and ammunition violations. And so those changes could result in net state and local correctional costs potentially, not likely to exceed the low millions of dollars annually.
Okay, well, up next we're going to talk about the other end of the continuum of crime, and that is the death penalty. Should it be made easier to enforce, or should it be abolished completely? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome. We're talking with experts from the nonpartisan State Legislative Analyst Office about a number of crime-related measures on the November ballot. California has two death penalty measures, competing measures on the ballot. Prop 62 would abolish the death penalty, while Prop 66 would shorten legal challenges and essentially speed up the process. Anita Lee with the LAO is still with us. She's a program policy expert on criminal justice generally and the death penalty specifically. So, before we get into the details of these two measures, what is the current status of the death penalty in California?
Sure. As of April 2016, 748 condemned inmates were in state prison with death sentences. These inmates are entitled to legal challenges in both federal and state courts, and they're really challenged in two ways: direct appeals and habeas corpus petitions. These legal challenges take a couple of decades to complete in California due to a variety of factors. Decades, yes.
So we're talking like 20 years.
20, sometimes even longer than that.
Okay.
And there are various reasons for these delays, including significant delays in the appointment of attorneys to represent those condemned
First, you got to have an
inmates.
attorney, and that takes a while to get a person appointed, and then you have to start the whole process.
And you have different attorneys for the different types, the direct appeal and the habeas corpus appeals. And so most of the inmates who are on death row are actually at various stages of the legal challenge process. On top of that, due to various legal issues surrounding the state's lethal injection procedures, no executions have taken place since 2006. And the state's currently in the process of developing regulations to allow executions to resume.
So the reality is we have a death penalty on the books, but it's not being enforced.
Yes.
And my understanding, looking at the numbers in your report, 80% of those that were convicted are on death row, are still in state prison. 11% died prior to execution, 7% had their sentences reduced, and only 2% have been executed since 1978. Since 1978, only
Yeah.
2%.
So, I mean, to
That's a low
give a
number.
little bit of frame of reference, since 1978, it's 930 individuals who received death sentences, and 15 have been executed.
Yeah, it's a very, very, very small number.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got these two competing death penalty measures on
Yes.
the ballot. We'll start with Prop 62.
Yes.
Now, that would abolish the death penalty. What are the major provisions of that proposition?
So under Proposition 62, offenders and existing inmates could no longer be sentenced to death for first-degree murder. Instead, the most serious penalty available would be life without the possibility of parole. The measure would also specify that inmates who are found guilty of murder have to work while they're in state prison and have their wages deducted to pay victims of crime.
Well, it's not like they're making a lot of money. I'm assuming it's like
That's-
minimum wage or sub-minimum wage.
That's a fair point. It's also subject to state regulations. So CDCR, the Department of Corrections, has regulations for different security levels and who's allowed to work and who isn't.
So right now, though, if they're on death row and or life without possibility of parole, they're still working. They still now today give money to the
They
victims?
do. This measure would increase the percentage from 50% to 60% of the amount that could be deducted.
Okay. So what is the fiscal impact, you think, of if the death penalty was abolished? What would that
Sure.
cost? Is it cheaper to, frankly, to execute someone or to have them be in prison for the rest of their life?
So when we looked at Proposition 62, we did estimate that it would reduce net state and local costs by around $150 million annually within a few
So
years.
let me get this straight. So it's your analysis is it's less expensive to keep someone in prison for life than to go through the execution, that process.
Yeah, so the $150 million really breaks down to two portions. The first portion is that you would have reduced costs from reduced workload to the state and local courts, the attorneys at the local level, and jails for housing them.
Because now you're not going to be doing that second phase about whether a death penalty applies. You just automatically life without parole.
Yeah, you're not going to be doing the second phase. Attorneys, so local attorneys will staff more attorneys if it's a death penalty case. County jails have to house them until they're done. And then on the flip side, at the state prison level when they're housed, it's generally more expensive for the prisons to house condemned inmates because there are higher security measures to house and supervise the condemned inmates than compared to
now they'd be in the general population.
Life without the possibility of parole, so they'd be subject to kind of other security requirements. They could be, but they're, it's also possible
Let's talk about the other end of the continuum, and that's Prop 66, which would instead speed up executions. What are the major provisions in that proposition?
Yeah, so it really seeks to shorten the time that legal challenges take. And so there are a number of provisions. One thing that it requires is that habeas corpus petitions, one way to legally challenge a death sentence, first be heard at the trial courts instead of the California Supreme Court. It also places time limits on the legal challenges and changes the process for appointing attorneys to these condemned inmates. It also does a variety of other things, including exempting the state's execution procedures from state requirements for members of the public to have an opportunity to weigh in on the development of the regulations.
Yeah, I think it was the Administrative, this is getting a little technical, but the Administrative Procedures Act are saying you don't have to
Procedures
follow that. Normally when you do rules and regulations, you do have to follow that. So they are really making this thing, expediting this. So what's the fiscal impact?
So the fiscal impact related to this is that the ongoing state court costs for each individual legal challenge is pretty uncertain. That's because some of the provisions could reduce costs and some of them could increase costs. However, given the hundreds of pending cases, it is likely that in the near term, we're going to have state court costs potentially in the tens of millions of dollars annually from accelerating spending to meet the timeframes imposed by the measure. This would result in savings of similar amounts in future years.
Initially, though, it would cost a little more money.
But yes, and then also on the state prison side, you could have savings potentially in the tens of millions of dollars to the extent that the state changes how it houses the prisoners or additional executions take place.
Okay, so it's probably, that's a hard one to call. I guess it's uncertain.
One. Yes.
Okay, that's a good way to end up. I want to thank the state legislative analyst Mac Taylor and his staff, Anita Lee and Drew Soderberg, for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Report on Facebook or Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org and get us on the Maddy Daily. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.